The morning unfolded without urgency, the light moving slowly across the cracked earth as if unsure where to settle. Heat already hovered close to the ground, lifting faint shimmers from the stones near the dry riverbed. It was there, half-shadowed by a leaning acacia, that the lion lay. At first he blended into the dust, his tawny coat dulled by weeks of sun and wind. Only when the man slowed his steps did the shape separate itself from the land. Ribs pressed sharply beneath thinning fur. One hind leg lay twisted at an awkward angle. The chest rose, barely, in shallow intervals that seemed more like memory than breath. For several seconds nothing moved. Then the tail shifted, just once, a weak, delayed response to a passing fly. It was enough to stop the man where he stood. He lowered himself to one knee several meters away, careful not to disturb the fragile quiet. The lion's eyes were half open, filmed with dryness, unfocused on anything near or far. His ears twitched only when insects landed too close. The skin along his flank tightened faintly with each breath, as though effort alone was exhausting. Around them, the riverbed lay empty, its cracked channels tracing where water had once traveled with purpose. Scattered bones of small animals bleached in the sun told older stories of survival and loss. No pride waited nearby. No distant calls answered the wind. The silence held a particular weight, the kind that came not from peace but from absence. The man studied the ground, searching for tracks, for signs of recent movement, for proof that others still returned. There were none. He shifted his pack from one shoulder to the other and spoke without raising his voice. "It's okay, boy," he said quietly, not expecting recognition, only offering steadiness. The lion's whiskers trembled once, perhaps from breath, perhaps from fatigue. A soft rasp escaped his throat, not a sound of warning but of strain. His paws were dusty and scarred, pads cracked from long days of walking without rest. One foreleg bore an old wound, swollen and darkened at the edges, likely the reason he had fallen behind. Injury had slowed him. Weakness had followed. And somewhere along the way the pride had continued without him. Not from cruelty but from necessity. In the wild, distance grows quickly. Hunger makes decisions before loyalty can. The man remained still, allowing the air between them to settle. He noted the way the lion's breathing faltered when a gust of wind carried new scents. How his head lifted slightly, then sank back when strength failed. This was not simply starvation. This was isolation layered on exhaustion, injury layered on loss. A slow unraveling that happened quietly, far from attention. He reached for his radio but hesitated, watching one more rise and fall of the thin chest. Nearby, dry grass whispered against stone, stirred by a passing breeze. Dust lifted and drifted, settling again over old tracks and empty paths. Above, clouds moved lazily across a pale sky, unaware of the fragile life stretched below them, waiting, uncertain, fading, at the edge of survival. The following days unfolded with the same quiet rhythm, marked not by urgency but by return. Each morning and late afternoon, the man followed the same narrow path along the riverbed, careful to place his feet where dust had already settled. He came without haste, without calling out, without sudden movement. In his hands, he carried small containers of water and wrapped portions of meat, measured and plain. Nothing was offered quickly. Nothing was placed too close. Everything was done as though the space between them were something living, something that could be damaged if handled carelessly. At first, the lion barely acknowledged his presence. His body remained pressed to the ground, limbs folded tightly beneath him as if conserving every fragment of warmth and strength. His eyes followed movement only faintly, drifting open and closed with slow indifference. When the man stopped several meters away and set the water down, the lion's ears would flatten for a moment, then relax again, uncertain whether the sound belonged to danger or chance. The meat remained untouched for hours after the man left, drying in the heat before the lion gathered enough energy to drag it closer with hesitant claws. Each visit followed the same pattern. The man would sit cross-legged in the shade, sometimes for nearly an hour, doing nothing but breathing steadily and watching. He never reached out, never tried to shorten the distance. He allowed flies to gather on his sleeves and dust to coat his boots. The lion learned the shape of this patience. He learned that the figure did not advance, that the voice when it came was low and brief. "Easy now," the man whispered once, barely louder than the wind. The words dissolved into the air, leaving no demand behind them. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, small changes began to appear. The lion started lifting his head when footsteps approached. At first, it was only an inch or two, a trembling effort that lasted seconds before fatigue forced it back down. Later, it became a fuller motion, the neck stretching weakly as his eyes searched for the familiar outline. His breathing grew less ragged. The sharpness of his ribs softened slightly beneath a thin return of muscle. When he drank, he no longer collapsed immediately afterward, remaining upright long enough to swallow steadily. The ground around him changed too. Drag marks appeared where he shifted position. Paw prints formed shallow patterns in the dust. The faint scent of life, of presence, began to replace the emptiness that had once settled over the riverbed. At times, when the man placed the water down and stepped back, the lion released a soft, broken sound from his throat, half cough, half murmur, neither warning nor call, only the fragile effort of a body relearning motion. Trust did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated in small fragments, in the way the lion stopped flinching when shadows moved, in how his gaze lingered longer on the man's face, in the slight lowering of his head when food was offered. The man recognized these signs and answered them only with continued stillness. He never assumed permission. He never hurried the process. By the end of the second week, as evening light stretched thin and gold across the riverbed, the lion raised his head fully when the man approached. His eyes, still tired, now held a quiet steadiness. A breeze passed through the dry grass, lifting dust into slow spirals. Somewhere beyond the horizon, distant birds crossed the fading sky. And between them, in that quiet open space, two lives moved forward together, bound not by control, but by patience, returning day after day like the steady rhythm of breath. Strength returned quietly without announcement. It arrived first in small adjustments, the way the lion shifted his weight more often, how he began to stretch one foreleg forward in the mornings, testing the joint before pulling it back beneath him. His movements grew less fragile, less hesitant. When he rose to drink, he remained standing afterward, head lifted, scanning the open land with renewed attention. The hollow in his flank softened. The dullness in his coat gave way to a faint, uneven sheen. Life was threading itself back into him, one careful strand at a time. With that change came others, scattered across the landscape like subtle warnings. The man noticed new tracks along the edges of the riverbed, pressed lightly into dust that had once remained undisturbed for weeks. Some were large and fresh, overlapping older prints. Others vanished abruptly into rocky ground, as if their owners had chosen not to linger. At dawn, unfamiliar scents drifted through the air, sharp and animal, carried by wind from distant plains. Birds took flight more often without visible cause. Small antelope shifted their grazing patterns, lingering closer to brush and cover. The first roar came late one evening, carried thinly across the cooling air. It was distant, low and brief but unmistakable. The man froze where he sat, water container still in his hands. The lion's head lifted instantly, ears rotating toward the sound with sudden clarity. His body stiffened, muscles tightening along his spine. Another call followed minutes later, closer this time, vibrating faintly through the ground. It was not a challenge. Not yet. It was an announcement of presence, of territory reasserted. After that night, the land no longer felt empty. More signs appeared each day. Broken grass near watering points. Scratches along tree trunks. Faint markings left deliberately on stones and bushes. The man found tufts of fur caught on thorny branches, golden and coarse, unfamiliar in texture. At times, he sensed movement just beyond his field of vision, shapes dissolving into shadow before he could identify them. Even when nothing stirred, the air itself seemed charged with awareness, as though many unseen eyes were learning the rhythm of his visits. The lion responded in ways both subtle and profound. He began spending more time upright, sitting with his chest lifted and forepaws planted firmly in front of him. His gaze traveled farther now, following distant sounds and shifting light. Occasionally he released low, unfinished vocalizations, rough and uneven, as if practicing something long and used. Once, when a roar echoed closer than before, he attempted an answer. The sound that emerged was fractured and hoarse, collapsing halfway through, but the effort left his body trembling with instinct and memory. The man adjusted without conscious decision. He shortened his visits, sat farther back, spoke even less. "You're doing well," he murmured one afternoon, almost to himself. The lion flicked an ear, eyes never leaving the horizon. He understood what these changes meant. Recovery did not exist in isolation. Strength invited attention. Survival drew others back into the story. Somewhere nearby, a pride was moving again, searching, marking, reassembling its boundaries. Whether they had abandoned this lion deliberately or simply lost him to distance no longer mattered. What mattered was that they were close. Each evening, as shadows stretched longer and unfamiliar calls threaded through the darkening air, the man remained still and observant. Dust lifted under distant paws. Grass bent beneath unseen weight. The land was waking from stillness. And in that growing movement, in that quiet return of wild order, he sensed that his role, carefully, inevitably, was nearing its end. Evening settled slowly over the plains, layering the land in muted gold and gray. The heat loosened its grip, and long shadows stretched from acacia trunks and scattered stones, stitching dark lines across the open ground. The man arrived earlier than usual that day, aware of the change in the air, of the subtle pressure that had been building for days. He placed the water down carefully, then stepped back farther than before, leaving a wider circle of space between himself and the lion. The lion stood when he approached, rising with effort but without hesitation. His legs held. His body, though still lean, no longer trembled beneath its own weight. He faced the open plains, head high, ears forward, attention fixed on something beyond immediate sight. The man followed his gaze and saw nothing at first. Then, gradually, shapes began to separate from the distance. They emerged one by one, barely more than silhouettes at first. Low forms moving through tall grass, shoulders rolling in slow, deliberate rhythm. A large female led them, her outline confident and unbroken. Behind her followed two others, then a younger male, still thick with developing muscle. They advanced without sound, spreading slightly as they approached, forming a loose arc around the riverbed. The air tightened. The man did not move. He lowered himself onto one knee, keeping his hands visible and empty. His breathing slowed until it matched the soft rise and fall of the wind. "Easy," he whispered once, almost inaudibly. The pride halted several meters away. Their eyes reflected fading light, steady and alert. Tails flicked in measured patterns. One female circled wide, testing distance, her paws placing themselves with careful precision. Another paused near a thorn bush, head low, scenting the ground where water had been placed so many times before. The weakened lion remained still at the center. For a long moment he did nothing. His chest expanded deeply, drawing in air scented with kin and memory. Then he took a step forward. Not toward the pride. Not toward the man. But into the narrow space between them. His head lowered slightly. His tail curved loosely behind him. He released a soft, uneven sound, fragile but unmistakably deliberate. It was neither challenge nor plea. It was recognition. The large female responded first. She advanced slowly, stopping just beyond reach. Their noses aligned briefly, separated by inches of warm air. She exhaled. He answered with a quiet breath of his own. Her shoulder brushed his lightly as she passed, leaving behind scent and contact, a silent acceptance. Only then did he turn his head. His eyes met the man's for a brief second, steady, unafraid, no longer clouded by desperation. He did not approach. He did not retreat. He simply held that stillness, acknowledging the presence that had carried him through emptiness and back to this moment. "Good," the man murmured, voice barely sound. The pride closed in around their returning member, forming a living barrier of muscle and movement. Bodies pressed close. Low rumbles passed between them, felt more than heard. One by one they began drifting eastward, guided by instinct and fading light. The lion hesitated once, glancing back toward the riverbed where he had waited so long. Then he followed. As darkness deepened and wind moved softly through dry grass, the plains reclaimed their ancient rhythm. Somewhere beyond sight, the pride settled into motion again, and under a sky thinning into stars, two worlds parted quietly, bound forever by a moment of shared trust. They moved without urgency, as if guided by an understanding older than memory. The pride formed around the recovering lion in a loose, protective pattern, bodies aligning and separating in quiet coordination. One female walked slightly ahead, parting tall grass with steady shoulders. Another remained close at his side, her flank occasionally brushing his, offering balance through simple contact. The younger male followed behind, watchful but restrained. Together, they shaped a living corridor, easing him forward into the growing depth of green and shadow. The lion's steps were slow but certain. Each placement of his paws carried intention now, no longer driven by desperation or fatigue. His breathing remained heavy, yet it no longer fractured with weakness. When he stumbled once on uneven ground, he recovered without falling, steadied by the presence of those beside him. A low rumble passed between them, barely audible, more vibration than sound. It flowed through the grass and into the soil, binding them in motion. The man remained where he was. He did not rise. He did not follow. He watched from the edge of the riverbed, hands resting loosely on his knees, allowing distance to grow naturally between himself and the departing group. He studied the way the lion's outline gradually softened into the landscape, how his once isolated form now blended seamlessly among others. There was no ceremony in their leaving. No final pause. No backward glance. It was simply the continuation of life in its most honest form. As they advanced, the tall grass closed behind them, erasing visible paths. Only faint movement betrayed their direction, a ripple traveling across the plains before fading into stillness. The wind shifted and carried away their scent. Dust settled where paws had pressed moments before. What had been fragile and uncertain only weeks earlier now dissolved back into wild order. The man exhaled slowly. Around him, the land began returning to itself. Insects resumed their soft, rhythmic hum. A distant bird called once, then fell silent. The riverbed, long emptied of water, reflected pale evening light along its cracked surface. He gathered the empty containers, folding cloth carefully, packing each item with the same quiet precision that had defined his visits. There was no regret in his movements, only completion. He stood at last and took one final look toward the grassland. Nothing stirred. No eyes watched. No forms lingered at the boundary. The space where the lion had once lain motionless now held only flattened earth and faint impressions slowly fading beneath wind and time. As he turned away, the sky deepened into soft layers of amber and blue. Clouds drifted slowly, thinning as stars began to emerge. A gentle breeze passed through dry stalks, producing a low, continuous whisper that traveled across the plains. Somewhere far beyond sight, the pride continued forward, guided by instinct, by memory, by renewed strength. And here, in this quiet place between past struggle and future movement, the land absorbed what had happened. It held the imprint of patience. It held the trace of shared survival. And as darkness settled gently over grass and stone, the plains rested once more, breathing, enduring, remembering.